Talk. The New Conservatism and Office. 1834 to 1845. I consider the Reform Bill a final and irrevocable settlement of a great constitutional question. If by adopting the spirit of the Reform Bill it be meant that we are to live in a perpetual vortex of agitation, that public men can only support themselves in public estimation by adopting every popular impression of the day, by promising the instant redress of anything that anybody may call an abuse, I will not undertake to adopt it. But if the spirit of the Reform Bill implies merely a careful review of institutions civil and ecclesiastical, undertaken in a friendly temper, the correction of proved abuses and the redress of real grievances, then, etc. Peel, Tamworth Address. Miscellaneous reading. The autumn of 1834 was spent at Foscay. An observant, I followed political affairs, but hardly a word is said about them in the diary. A stiff battle was kept up against electioneering iniquities at Newark. Riding, boating, shooting were Mr. Gladstone's pastimes in the day, billiards, singing, backgammon, and a rubber in the evening. Sport was not without compunction which might well, in an age that counts itself humane, be expected to come oftener. Had to kill a wounded partridge, he records, and felt after it as if I had shot the albatross. It might be said, this should be more or less. And that was true. He was always a great walker. He walked from Montrose, some 13 or 14 miles off, in 2 hours and 3/4, and another time he does 6 miles in 70 minutes. Nor does he ever walk with an unobserving mind. At Lochnagar, saw Highland women from Strathspey coming down for harvest with heavy loads, some with babies, over these wild rough paths through wind and storm. Ah, with what labor does a large portion of mankind subsist, while we fare sumptuously every day. This was the ready susceptibility to humane impression in the common circumstance of life, the eye stirring the emotions of the feeling heart, that nourished in him the soul of true oratory, to say nothing of feeding the roots of statesmanship. His book-mindedness is unabated. He began with a resolution to work at least 2 hours every morning before breakfast, and the resolution seems to have been manfully kept, without prejudice to systematic reading for a good many hours of the day besides. For the first time, rather strange to say, he read St. Augustine's Confessions, and with the delight that might have been expected. He finds in that famous composition a good deal of prolix and fanciful, though acute speculation, but the practical parts of the book have a wonderful force, an inimitable sweetness and simplicity. In other departments of religion, he read Archbishop Leighton's Life and Hannah More's, Arnold's Sermons and Milner's Church History and Wool's Bridgewater Treatise. Once more he analyses the Novum Organum and the Advancement of Learning, and he reads or rereads Locke's essay. He studies political science in the two great manuals of the Old World and the New, in the Politics of Aristotle and the Prince of Machiavelli. He goes through 3 or 4 plays of Schiller, also Manzoni, and Petrarch, and Dante at the patient rate of a couple of cantos a day, then Boccaccio, from whom, after a half-dozen of the days, he willingly parts company, only interested in him as showing a strange state of manners and how religion can be dissociated from conduct. In modern politics he reads the memoirs of Chatham and Brougham on colonial policy, of which he says that eccentricity, paradox, fast and loose reasoning and, much more, sentiment, appear to have entered most deeply into the essence of this remarkable man when he wrote his colonial policy, as now, with the rarest power of expressing his thoughts, has he any fixed law to guide them? On Roscoe's Leo X he remarks how interesting and highly agreeable it is in style, and while disclaiming any right to judge its fidelity and research, makes the odd observation that it has in some degree subdued the leaven of its author's Unitarianism. He writes occasional verses, including the completion of some stanzas of December 1832 on the human heart, but I am not impudent enough to call them by that name. In the midst of days well filled by warm home feeling, reasonable pleasure, and vigorous animation of intellect came the summons to action. On November 18, a guest arrived with the astonishing news that ministers were out. The King had dismissed the Melbourne government, partly because he did not believe that Lord John Russell could take the place of Althorpe as leader of the Commons, partly because like many cleverer judges he was sick of them, and partly because, as is perhaps the case with more cabinets than the world supposes, the ministers were sick of one another, and King William knew it. Mr. Gladstone in 1875-63 described the dismissal of the Whigs in 1834 as the indiscreet proceeding of an honest and well-meaning man, which gave the Conservatives a momentary tenure of office without power, but provoked a strong reaction in favor of the Liberals, and greatly prolonged the predominance which they were on the point of losing through the play of natural causes. 64. Sir Robert Peel was summoned in hot haste from Rome, and after a journey of 12 days over Alpine snows, 8 nights out of the 12 in a carriage, on December 9 he reached London, saw the King and kissed hands as First Lord of the Treasury. Less than 2 years before, he had said, "I feel that between me and office there is a wider gulf than there is perhaps between it and any other man in the House." Proposal of office. Mr. Gladstone meanwhile at Foscay worked off some of his natural excitement, which he notes as invading even Sundays, by the composition of a political tract. The tract has disappeared down the gulf of time. December 11th was his father's 70th birthday, his strength and energy wonderful and giving promise of many more. Within the week the fated message from the new Prime Minister arrived. The case is apt to quicken the pulse of even the most serene of politicians, and we may be sure that Mr. Gladstone, with the keen vigor of 25 tingling in his veins, was something more or less than serene. December 17th. Locke and Russell's Modern Europe in the morning. Went to meet the post, found a letter from Peel desiring to see me, dated 13th. All haste, ready by 4, no place. Reluctantly deferred till the morning. Wrote to Lincoln, Sir Art Peel, etc. A game of whist. This is a serious call. I got my father's advice to take anything with work and responsibility. 18th. Off at 7:40 by mail. I find it a privation to be unable to read in a coach. The mind is distracted through the senses, and rambles. Nowhere is it to me so incapable of continuous thought. Newcastle at 9:15 p.m. 19th. Same again. At York at 6:15 a.m. to 7. Ran to peep at the minster and bore away a faint twilight image of its grandeur. 20th. Arrived safe, thank God, and well at the Bull and Mouth 5:75 a.m. Albany soon. To bed for 2¼ hours. Went to Peel about 11. He writes to his father the same day. My interview with him was not more than 6 or 8 minutes, but he was extremely kind. He told me his letter to me was among his first, that he was prompted only by his own feelings towards me and some more of that kind, that I might have a seat either at the Admiralty or Treasury boards, but the latter was that which he intended for me, that I should then be in immediate and confidential communication with himself, and should thereby have more insight into the general concerns of government, that there was a person very anxious for the seat at the Treasury, who would go to the Admiralty if I did not, but that he meant to go upon the principle of putting everyone to the post for which he thought them most fit, so far as he could, and therefore preferred the arrangement he had named. As he distinctly preferred the Treasury for me, and assigned such reasons for the preference, it appeared to me that the question was quite settled, and I immediately closed with his offer. I expressed my gratitude for the opinions of me which he had expressed, and said I thought it my duty to mention that the question of my re-election at Newark upon a single vacancy had never been put to my friends, and I asked whether I should consider any part of what he had said as contingent upon the answer I might receive from them. He said no, that he would willingly take that risk. At first, he thought I had suspicions about the Duke of Newcastle, and assured me that he would be much pleased, of which I said I felt quite persuaded. This inquiry, however, served the double purpose of discharging my own duty, and drawing out something about the dissolution. He said to me, "You will address your constituents upon vacating your seat, and acquaint them of your intention to solicit a renewal of their confidence whenever they are called upon to exercise their franchise, which I tell you confidentially," he added, "will be very soon." I would have given £100 to be then and there in a position to express my hopes and fears. But it is, then, you see, certain that we are to have it, and that they will not meet the present Parliament. most bitterly do I lament it. Mr. Gladstone at a later date, July 25, 1835, recorded that he had reason to believe from a conversation with a Tory friend who was in many party secrets, that the Duke of Wellington set their candidates in motion all over the country before Sir Robert's return. Active measures, and of course expense, had so generally begun, so much impatience for the dissolution had been excited, and the anticipations had been permitted for so long a time to continue and to spread, as to preclude the possibility of delay. 65. Second election at Newark. The appointment of the young member for Newark was noted at the time as an innovation upon a semi-sacred social usage. Sir Robert Inglis said to him, "You are about the youngest lord who was ever placed at the Treasury on his own account, and not because he was his father's son." The Prime Minister, no doubt, rejoiced in finding for the public service a young man of this high promise, sprung out of the same class, and bred in the same academic traditions as his own. 66. The youthful minister's path was happily smoothed at Newark. This time Blues and Reds called a grand truce, divided the honors, and returned Mr. Gladstone and Sergeant Wilde without a contest. The question that excited most interest in the canvass was the new Poor Law. Mr. Gladstone gave the fallen ministers full credit for their measure. Most of their bills, he said, were projected from a mere craving for popularity, but in the case of the Poor Law they acted in defiance of the public press and many of their own friends. On the other hand, he defended the new government as the government of a truly reforming party, pointing to the commercial changes made by Lord Liverpool's administration, to the Corporation and Test Acts, and to Catholic emancipation. Who could deny that these were changes of magnitude settled in peaceful times by a Parliament unreformed? Who could deny that Sir Robert Peel had long been a practical reformer of the law, and that the Duke of Wellington had carried out great retrenchments? Let them then rally round throne and altar, and resist the wild measures of the destructives. The red hero was drawn through the town by 6 greys, with postilions in silk jackets, amid the music of bands, the clash of bells, and the cheers of the crowd. When the red procession met the blue, mutual congratulations took the place of the old insult and defiance, and at 5 o'clock each party sat down to its own feast. The Reds drank toasts of a spirited, loyal, and constitutional character. Many admirable speeches were made which the chronicler regrets that his limits will not allow him to report, regrets unshared by us, and soon after 11 Mr. Gladstone escaped. After a day at Clumber, he was speedily on his way to London. Off at 10:30 p.m. missed the high flyer at Tuxford, broke down in my chaise on the way to Newark, no injury, thanks to God. Remained 2.5 hours alone, overtaken by the Wellington at 3:30 a.m. arrived in London, January 8, before 8 p.m. good travelling. On reckoning up his movements he finds that, though not at all fond of travelling for the sake of going from place to place, he has had in 1834 quite 2,400 miles of it. Before the dissolution, Sir H. Hardinge had told him that the Conservatives would not be over 340 nor under 300, but by the middle of the month things looked less prosperous. The reaction against the Whigs had not yet reached full flood. The royal dismissal of the administration was unpopular. Moderate people, more especially in Scotland, could not stand a government where the Duke of Wellington, the symbol of a benighted and stubborn Toryism, was seen over Peel's shoulder. At present, Mr. Gladstone writes, the case is, even in my view, hopeful, in that of most here it is more. And certainly, to have this very privilege of entertaining a deliberate and reasonable hope, to think that notwithstanding the £10 clause, a moderate Parliament may be returned, in fine, to believe that we have now some prospect of surviving the Reform Bill without a bloody revolution, is to me as surprising as delightful. It seems to me the greatest and most providential mercy with which a nation was ever visited. Today I am going to dine with the Lord Chancellor, Lyndhurst, having received a card to that effect last night. It was at this dinner that Mr. Gladstone had his first opportunity of making a remarkable acquaintance. In his diary he mentions as present 3 of the judges, the flower of the bench, as he supposes, but he says not a word of the man of the strangest destiny there, the author of Vivian Grey. Disraeli himself, in a letter to his sister, names young Gladstone, and others, but condemns the feast as rather dull, and declares that a swan very white and tender, and stuffed with truffles, was the best company at the table. What Mr. Gladstone carried away in his memory was a sage lesson of Lyndhurst's, by which the two men of genius at his table were in time to show themselves extremely competent to profit. Never defend yourself before a popular assemblage, except with and by retorting the attack. The hearers, in the pleasure which the assault gives them, will forget the previous charge. As Disraeli himself put it afterwards, never complain and never explain. 2. Change of office. One afternoon, a few days later, while he was grappling at the Treasury with a file of papers on the mysteries of superannuation, Mr. Gladstone was again summoned by the Prime Minister, and again, January 26, he writes to his father. I have had an important interview with Sir R. Peel, the result of which is that I am to be Under-Secretary for the Colonies. I will give you a hurried and imperfect sketch of the conversation. He began by saying he was about to make a great sacrifice both of his own feelings and convenience, but that what he had to say he hoped would be gratifying to me, as a mark of his confidence and regard. I am going to propose to you, Gladstone, that you should be, for you know Wortley has lost his election, Under-Secretary of State for the Colonies, and I give you my word that I do not know 6 offices which are at this moment of greater importance than that to which is attached the representation of the Colonial Department in the House of Commons, at a period when so many questions of importance are in agitation. I expressed as well as I could, and indeed it was but ill, my unfeigned and deep sense of his kindness, my hesitation to form any opinion of my own competency for the office, and at the same time my general desire not to shrink from any responsibility which he might think proper to lay upon me. He said that was the right and manly view to take. He adverted to my connection with the West Indies as likely to give satisfaction to persons dependent on those colonies, and thought that others would not be displeased. In short, I cannot go through it all, but I can only say that if I had always heard of him that he was the warmest and freest person of all living in the expression of his feelings, such description would have been fully borne out by his demeanor to me. When I came away he took my hand and said, "Well, God bless you, wherever you are." From Sir Robert the new Under-Secretary made his way, in fear and trembling, to his new chief, Lord Aberdeen. Distinction of itself naturally and properly rather alarms the young. I had heard of his high character, but I had also heard of him as a man of cold manners, and close and even haughty reserve. It was dark when I entered his room, so that I saw his figure rather than his countenance. I do not recollect the matter of the conversation, but I well remember that, before I had been 3 minutes with him, all my apprehensions had melted away like snow in the sun. I came away from that interview conscious indeed of his dignity, but of a dignity so tempered by a peculiar purity and gentleness, and so associated with impressions of his kindness and even friendship, that I believe I thought more about the wonder of his being at that time so misunderstood by the outer world, than about the new duties and responsibilities of my office. 67. Time only deepened these impressions. It is not hard for a great party chief to win the affection and regard of his junior colleague, and where good fortune has brought together a congenial pair, no friendship outside the home can be more valuable, more delightful, alike to veteran and to tyro. Of all the host of famous or considerable men with whom he was to come into official and other relations, none ever, as we shall see, held the peculiar place in Mr. Gladstone's esteem and reverence of the 2 statesmen under whose auspices he now first entered the enchanted circle of public office. The promotion was a remarkable stride. He was only 25, his parliamentary existence had barely covered 2 years, and he was wholly without powerful family connection. You are aware, Peel wrote to John Gladstone, of the sacrifice I have made of personal feeling to public duty, in placing your son in one of the most important offices, that of representative of the Colonial Department in the House of Commons, and thus relinquishing his valuable aid in my own immediate department. Wherever he may be placed, he is sure to distinguish himself. 68. 3. Position of government. Mr. Gladstone's first spell of office was little more than momentary. The Liberal majority, as has so often happened, was composite, but Peel can hardly have supposed that the sections of which it was made up would fail to coalesce, and coalesce pretty soon, for the irresistible object of ejecting ministers who were liked by none of them, and through whose repulse they could strike an avenging blow against the king. Ardent subalterns like Mr. Gladstone took more vehement views. The majority at once beat the government, supported by the group of Stanleyites, 53 strong, in the contest for the Speaker's chair. Other repulses followed. The division, writes Mr. Gladstone to his father, with the honourable warmth of the young party man, I need not say was a disappointment to me, but it must have been much more so to those who have ever thought well of the Parliament. Our party mustered splendidly. Some few, but very, very few, of the others appear to have kept away through a sense of decency. They had not virtue enough to vote for the man whom they knew to be incomparably the best, and against whom they had no charge to bring. No more shameful act, I think, has been done by a British House of Commons. Not many days after fervently deprecating a general resignation, an ill-omened purpose of this very course actually flitted across the mind of the young Under-Secretary himself. A scheme was on the anvil for the education of the blacks in the West Indies, and a sudden apprehension startled Mr. Gladstone, that his chief might devote public funds to all varieties of denominational religious teaching. Any plan of that kind would be utterly opposed to what with him, as we shall soon discover, was then a fundamental principle of national polity. Happily the fatal leap was not needed, but if either small men like the government whips, or great men like Peel and Aberdeen, could have known what was passing, they would have shaken grave heads over this spirit of unseasonable scruple at the very start of the race in a brilliant man with all his life before him. February 4 or 5. Charles Canning told me Peel had offered him the vacant lordship of the Treasury, through his mother. They were, he said, very much gratified with the manner in which it had been done, though the offer was declined, upon the ground stated in the reply, that though he did not anticipate any discrepancy in political sentiments to separate him from the present government, yet he should prefer in some sense deserving an official station by parliamentary conduct. Peel's letter was written at some length, very friendly, without any statesmanlike reserve or sensitive attention to nicety of style. In the last paragraph it spoke with amiable embarrassment of Mr. Canning, stating that his respect, regard, and admiration, I think even, apparently interrupted by circumstances, continued fresh and vivid, and that those very circumstances made him more desirous of thus publicly testifying his real sentiments. March 30. Wished to speak on Irish Church. No opportunity. Wrote on it. A noble-minded speech from Sir J. A. Graham. March 31. Spoke on the Irish Church under 40 minutes. I cannot help here recording that this matter of speaking is really my strongest religious exercise. On all occasions, and today especially, was forced upon me the humiliating sense of my inability to exercise my reason in the face of the HFC, and of the necessity of my utterly failing, unless God gave me the strength and language. It was after all a poor performance, but would have been poorer had he never been in my thoughts as a present and powerful aid. But this is what I am as yet totally incompetent to effect, to realize, in speaking, anything, however small, which at all satisfies my mind. Debating seems to me less difficult, though unattained. But to hold in serene contemplative action the mental faculties in the turbid excitement of debate, so as to see truth clearly and set it forth such as it is, this I cannot attain to. As regards my speech in the Irish Church debate, he tells his father, April 2, it was received by the House, and has been estimated, in a manner extremely gratifying to me. As regards satisfaction to myself in the manner of its execution, I cannot say so much. Backed by a numerous and warm-hearted party, and strong in the consciousness of a good cause, I did not find it difficult to grapple with the more popular parts of the question, but I fell miserably short of my desires in touching upon the principles which the discussion involved, and I am sure that it must be long before I am enabled in any reasonable sense to be a speaker according even to the conception which I have formed in my own mind. A few days later, he received the congratulations of a royal personage. In the evening, dining at Lord Salisbury's, I was introduced to the Duke of Cumberland, who was pleased to express himself favourably of my speech. He is fond of conversation, and the common reputation which he bears of including in his conversation many oaths, appears to be but too true. Yet he said he had made a point of sending his son to George IV's funeral, thinking it an excellent advantage for a boy to receive the impression which such a scene was calculated to convey. The Duke made many acute remarks, and was, I should say, most remarkably unaffected in kind. These are fine social qualities for a prince, though, of course, not the most important, my dear sir, and thumps on the shoulder after a 10 minutes acquaintance. He spoke broadly and freely much on the disappearance of the bishop's wigs, which he said had done more harm to the church than anything else. Ministers defeated. On the same night the catastrophe happened. After a protracted and complex struggle, Lord John Russell's proposal for the appropriation of the surplus revenues of the Irish Church was carried against ministers. The following day Peel announced his resignation. Though his official work had been unimportant, Mr. Gladstone had left an excellent impression behind him among the permanent men. When he first appeared in the office, Henry Taylor said, "I rather like Gladstone, but he is said to have more of the devil in him than appears." A few weeks were enough to show him that Gladstone was far the most considerable of the rising generation, having besides his abilities an excellent disposition and great strength of character. James Stephen thought well of him, but doubted if he had pugnacity enough for public life. A few days later Mr. Gladstone dined with an official party at the fallen ministers. Sir R. Peel made a very nice speech on Lincoln's proposing and our drinking his health. The following is a slight and bad sketch. I really can hardly call you gentlemen alone. I would rather address you as my warm and attached friends in whom I have the fullest confidence, and with whom it has afforded me the greatest satisfaction to be associated during the struggle which has just been brought to a close. In undertaking the government, from the first I have never expected to succeed, still it was my conviction that good might be done, and I trust that good has been effected. I believe we have shown that even if a conservative government be not strong enough to carry on the public affairs of this country, at least we are so strong that we ought to be able to prevent any other government from doing any serious mischief to its institutions. We meet now as we met at the beginning of the session, then perhaps in somewhat finer dresses, but not, I am sure, with kindlier feelings towards each other. The rest of the session Mr. Gladstone passed in his usual pursuits, reading all sorts of books, from the correspondence of Leibnitz with Bossuet and Alexander Knox's remains, down to Rousseau's Confessions. As to the last of these he scarcely knew whether to read on or to throw it aside, and, in fact, he seems only to have persevered with that strange romance of a wandering soul for a day or two. Besides promiscuous reading, he performed some scribbling, including a sonnet, recorded in his diary with notes of wondering exclamation. His family were in London for most of May, his mother in bad health. No other engagement ever interrupted his sedulous attendance on her every day, reading the Bible to her, and telling the news about levees and drawing-rooms, a great dinner at Sir Robert Peel's, and all the rest of his business and recreations. In the House he did little between the fall of the ministry and the close of the session. He once wished to speak, but was shut out by the length of other speeches. So, he moralises, I had 2 useful lessons instead of 1. For the sense of helplessness which always possesses me in prospect of a speech is one very useful lesson, and being disappointed after having attained some due state of excitement and anticipation is another. Speech at Newark. In June at a feast at Newark, which, terrible to relate, lasted from 4 o'clock to 11, Mr. Gladstone gave them nearly an hour, not to mention divers minor speeches. His father expressed himself with beautiful and affectionate truth of feeling, and the party sympathized. His own speech deserves to be noted as indicating the political geography for 3 or 4 years to come. The standing dish of the Tory opposition of the period was highly spiced reproach of the ministers for living on the support of O'Connell, and Newark was regaled with an ample meal. Mr. Gladstone would not enter into a detail of the exploits, character, political opinions of that Irish gentleman. He would rather say what he thought of him in his presence than in his absence, because he could unfortunately say nothing of him but what was bad. This is not the first period in English history, Mr. Gladstone noted down at that time, in which a government has leaned on the Roman Catholic interest in Ireland for support. Under the administration of Strafford and at the time of the Scotch Revolt, Charles I was enthusiastically supported by the recusants of the sister isle, and what was the effect? The religious sympathies of the people were touched then, and they were so now, with the same consequence, in the gradual decline of the party to whom the suspicion attaches in popular fervor and estimation. Half a century later he may have recalled this early fruit of historic observation. Meanwhile, in his Newark speech, he denounced the government for seeking to undo the mischief of the Irish alliance by systematic agitation. But it was upon the church question, far deeper and more vital than municipal corporations, that the fate of the government should be decided. Then followed a vindication of the church in Ireland. The Protestant faith is held good for us, and what is good for us is also good for the population of Ireland. That most disastrous of all our false commonplaces was received at Newark, as it has been received so many hundreds of times ever since all over England, with loud and long continued cheering, to be invariably followed in after act and event with loud and long continued groaning. 69. 4 years later Mr. Gladstone heard words from Lord John Russell on this point, that began to change his mind. Often do I think, he wrote to Lord Russell in 1870, of a saying of yours more than 30 years back which struck me ineffaceably at the time. You said, the true key to our Irish debates was this, that it was not properly borne in mind that as England is inhabited by Englishmen, and Scotland by Scotchmen, so Ireland is inhabited by Irishmen. 70. Footnotes, 63, Gleanings, Ike page 38. 64. In another place he describes it as an action done with no sort of reason, i.e. page 78. But the Melbourne Papers, published in 1890, pages 219 to 221 and 225, indicate that Melbourne had spontaneously given the king good reasons for cashiering him and his colleagues. 65. Lord Palmerston doubted, November 25, 1834, whether Peel would dissolve. I think his own bias will rather be to abide by the decision of this House of Commons, and try to propitiate it by great professions of reform. The effect of a dissolution must be injurious to the principles that he professes. But he may be overborne by the violent people of his own party whom he will not be able to control. Ashley's Life of Palmerston, 1879, page 313. 66. Greville, on the other hand, grumbled at Peel for taking high birth and connections as substitutes for other qualities, because he made Sidney Herbert secretary at the Board of Control, instead of making him a Lord of the Treasury, and sending Gladstone, who was a very clever man, to the other and more responsible post. 67. Lord Stanmore's Earl of Aberdeen, 1893, page 3. 68. Parker's Peel, 2. Page 267. 69. O'Connell paid Newark a short visit in 1836, spoke against Mr. Gladstone for an hour in the open air, and then left the town, both he and it much as they had been before his arrival. 70. Walpole, Life of Lord John Russell, 2. Page 455.